My name is Kate, and I was 31 when my life took an unexpected turn. After working at the same company for 5 years, my boyfriend of 3 years proposed to me. I found myself swept up in a whirlwind of wedding and honeymoon preparations. Our story began at work, where David was my supervisor, always there to guide me through challenging projects with a steady hand. What a contrast it was to my college days, when my shy nature had led to a quiet end to my first love. Life after graduation had brought changes I never could have imagined. David, 4 years older than me, seemed like someone I could trust completely, a man of integrity and warmth. Our love story blossomed during a date at the aquarium, where I bought a small dolphin figurine that still holds a special place in my heart. The way he spoke about our future together filled me with a joy I'd never known before. When he proposed at that same aquarium, I was so overwhelmed with happiness that sleep eluded me that night. But the rosy mist of romance began to clear when we visited his parents shortly after our engagement. While his father welcomed me with open arms, his mother's criticism cut through me like a knife from the very first meeting. Her harsh words planted seeds of doubt about what married life might really hold in store for me. The recent passport incident only magnified these concerns, exposing deeper issues I might have been unconsciously avoiding. I kept telling myself that pre-wedding jitters were perfectly normal, like a mantra I repeated in quiet moments of doubt. Despite my growing anxiety, I maintained a facade of calm as wedding preparations continued. During discussions about our future life together, it became clear that both David and his mother expected me to quit my job after marriage. Though I'd once thought leaving work after marriage might be nice, something about their expectation felt wrong in my gut. My career had become my anchor, and in the midst of all this uncertainty about marriage, I wasn't ready to let it go. Despite his mother's repeated suggestions about resignation, I stood firm in my decision to continue working at the same company as David. As we moved forward with wedding preparations, we disagreed about when to file our marriage registration. David pushed for an earlier date, and I eventually yielded to his timeline. Though the registration process itself was purely bureaucratic, becoming officially married filled me with a deep sense of joy. We had originally planned an intimate wedding ceremony, but everything changed after David told his mother. She called the very next day, declaring that David deserved a grand wedding and she would make sure of it. She insisted that I keep my guest list short, limited to just my parents and closest friends, claiming my friends would only bore everyone and ruin the atmosphere. Her words weren't just suggestions. They were commands, and she took control of everything from the venue to the guest list. Reluctantly, I agreed to limit my guests to just family and close friends, as she demanded. But her interference didn't stop there. She had opinions about every single detail, from the program to the entertainment, decorations, and menu. Following her elaborate plans meant exceeding our agreed-upon budget significantly. Though David's family had initially promised to pay half the wedding costs, they suddenly withdrew their offer, leaving me to shoulder the additional expenses from his mother's grand ideas. When I tried to make more economical choices to manage costs, she criticized those too, accusing me of making the wedding look cheap by not following her instructions. My attempts to discuss the mounting expenses with David were met with silence. The anxieties I'd had before marriage only grew stronger afterward. We had been planning what seemed like a fairy tale honeymoon abroad, at a place I'd always dreamed of visiting. But my excitement was dampened by David's strange behavior and the looming reality that we would be living with his mother after our return. Despite the importance of the trip, David was unusually uncooperative with the planning. Strangely, he insisted on handling all the flight and hotel bookings himself. I naively believed he was planning a romantic getaway, feeling grateful and relieved for even his smallest contribution. Little did I know this was just the prelude to a shocking revelation. As the wedding chaos settled and our honeymoon approached, I was determined to enjoy the trip despite my mixed feelings about recent events and the life ahead. However, while I was packing my suitcase for our early morning flight, David casually dropped a bombshell. "Kate, I'm taking this trip with my mother," he declared while double-checking his luggage. I stood there stunned, unable to comprehend his words. I protested, reminding him this wasn't just any trip but our honeymoon, and that we only had 2 tickets and reservations for 2 people. His next words made me stagger. He told me he'd never said he was traveling with me, called me foolish, and said this was a gratitude trip for everything his mother had done. He told me to stay home and clean the house thoroughly. Before I could respond, he tore up my passport. The very same passport I had trusted him to keep safe. At that moment, his mother walked into our room without knocking, fully packed and ready. "David, are you ready?" she sang out. His face lit up with joy as he replied that he was ready to finally enjoy a trip without interference. They laughed together while I stood there completely bewildered. In that moment, I realized I had married someone who was living out a real nightmare. While I had been worried about how to cope with living with my mother-in-law, this situation exceeded anything I could have imagined. I told them I could now see exactly what kind of people they both were, but my words seemed to have little effect as they walked out together, laughing. What I had mistaken for David's helpful involvement in planning our honeymoon had actually been him arranging everything for his mother, booking everything in her name. He had made all reservations under her name from the start, while pushing all the costs onto me. My husband's betrayal cut deep, but my sadness was completely overshadowed by anger. What should have been our most precious memories, an intimate dream wedding and perfect honeymoon, had been destroyed by my mother-in-law's and husband's selfish actions. Overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening, I struggled to accept this harsh reality. After the incident with David and his mother, I realized I needed to make a swift and definitive decision. Divorce was necessary. Interestingly, I had been recording audio since the wedding preparations began. What started as a sentimental project to document the joy and meaning of our wedding and honeymoon quickly became valuable evidence of my mother-in-law's behavior and harassment. Though I had initially doubted the usefulness of these recordings, thinking I'd never want to hear them again, they ironically became crucial evidence for my impending divorce. In the days following that disaster, instead of settling into our shared home, I was preparing to pack up and leave. The preparation went quickly since I had barely unpacked. While getting ready to leave, anger still smoldered inside me about David and his mother taking our honeymoon without me, but I forced myself to focus on my next steps. While doing one final cleaning to erase traces of my brief stay, I discovered shocking evidence in the living room. I found documents showing David had been embezzling money from the company. As a sales representative, he had been underreporting profits and pocketing the difference. Shockingly, his mother was involved too. She had kept meticulous records of actual sales, embezzled amounts, and a list of luxury items David had bought her with the stolen money. A diary detailing their scheme lay carelessly out in the open. As I stood there stunned by the scale of their deception, I immediately understood the gravity of the situation. I initially considered using my position at the company to handle the situation quietly, but quickly dismissed that thought. Why should I protect someone who had coldly abandoned me for a trip with his mother? With evidence of embezzlement in hand, I went directly to the company. My appearance at work caused quite a stir among colleagues and supervisors, as David and his mother were supposed to be in a tropical paradise with me. When asked, "Aren't you on your honeymoon?" I saw no reason to hide the truth anymore. I explained how David and his mother had destroyed my passport and taken my honeymoon without me, forcing me to cover all the costs. The shock and outrage from my colleagues was palpable. Fortunately, I had one powerful ally at the company: my uncle, who was a senior executive. Our relationship had been kept secret to avoid accusations of nepotism. I had earned my position on merit, and my uncle had agreed to keep our family connection private. Since childhood, my uncle had shown me great affection, treating me like his own daughter. We shared many memories, like childhood trips where he'd buy me sweets despite my parents' protests. Armed with evidence of David's misconduct and my uncle's support, I found the strength to face the situation head-on. When I approached my uncle with the evidence, he was surprised but cooperative. Revealing the extent of the betrayal I had experienced was difficult, but it was also the first step toward reclaiming my independence and integrity after this deeply unsettling chapter of my life. We hadn't seen each other since this disaster began. After explaining the situation to his secretary, I knocked on my uncle's office door and was allowed in. My uncle initially greeted me with a warm smile, but his expression quickly turned serious when he realized something was wrong. "Shouldn't you be on your honeymoon?" he asked with concern in his voice. Seeing his kind face, emotions overwhelmed me, and I broke down crying. Through sobs, I told him about all the horrible experiences. David's betrayal, the honeymoon that turned into a mother-son trip, and the discovery of David's embezzlement. My uncle's expression changed from concern to anger. A side of him I'd never seen before. Frowning as he listened carefully, he promised to convene a board meeting immediately to address the situation. After I handed over the evidence, my uncle asked about my plans for the day. When I told him I was heading home, he suggested, "Let's get something good to eat first, then I'll drive you home." Despite the incredible betrayal I had experienced, I felt truly comforted knowing there were still caring, kind people like my uncle in my life. 2 weeks later, when my husband and his mother returned from their trip, I received an angry phone call from him. He was furious that I hadn't picked them up at the airport and hadn't cleaned the house as he'd ordered. While he was violently berating me about my absence, I cut him off. I had already started divorce proceedings with a top divorce lawyer recommended by my uncle. "You two are noisy and annoying," I said firmly. "I don't want to hear your voice anymore. Why should I pick up someone I'm divorcing? Why should I follow your ridiculous cleaning orders?" David was speechless for a moment before resuming his angry tirade. He demanded, "How dare you talk like that? Marrying you was a favor from me. After divorcing me, no one will ever marry you again. Mother is angry too. If you come back right now and cook our meal, we might forgive you. We're tired of foreign food. Make some good home-cooked meals." His words were crueler than ever, completely exposing his true nature. After the passport incident and choosing to travel with his mother, everything about him had become painfully clear. "I've already consulted a lawyer about the divorce. You should discuss other matters with him," I replied calmly. "A lawyer? What are you talking about? I'm not getting divorced," he responded in confusion, panic seeping into his voice. I could hear his mother in the background, demanding the phone and hurling insults at me. "Do whatever you want. Oh, and by the way, I reported your embezzlement to the company. Expect to hear from them soon. You might want to find a lawyer," I replied, sensing his growing panic. It was no longer my problem. He kept calling, but I simply blocked his number. My uncle, knowing our honeymoon schedule, had already taken action. The company called my husband in based on the evidence I provided and confirmed all the fraud. In front of the company executives, my husband desperately fabricated a story, claiming I was the real embezzler and he had been trying to stop me. At that point, my uncle couldn't contain his anger and shouted, "My niece. My niece would never do such a thing. We've confirmed the embezzlement by you and your mother. You're lucky we haven't reported this to the police yet." Realizing my connections to upper management and that his fraud had been exposed, my husband looked devastated, as if he had lost everything. That day, I went to the company to return wedding gifts to my colleagues due to the sudden end of my marriage. However, everyone refused to take them back, insisting they were given as tokens of support. During this chaotic time in my life, I felt their kindness even more deeply. While surrounded by my colleagues' support, my estranged husband approached desperately. He begged, "Why didn't you tell me about your connections to upper management? I'm sorry, can't we start over? Can't you ask your uncle to let me stay at the company and forget about the embezzlement?" Feeling nauseated by his audacity, I responded, "Do you even hear yourself? Have you lost your mind? Divorce is the only option. Reflect on your actions and face the consequences." When I firmly pushed him away, it became clear he had no one to turn to. His desperate clinging was pitiful. Colleagues who witnessed this called security, and he was immediately escorted out. He was fired on the spot, and the company began seeking compensation for the embezzlement. During this chaos, my mother-in-law repeatedly tried to contact my family. However, after one conversation with my father-in-law, those calls stopped. I had wondered why he hadn't stopped our honeymoon plans, but later understood his perspective. He explained and apologized that he had been deceived, believing his wife was going on a trip with friends. He had hoped for some peace away from her constant complaints about shopping and dining out. After the scandal, my father-in-law supported my decision to return home and helped me pack my belongings. Amidst high emotions, I left without saying much. Knowing his honest, kind, and rational nature, I understood that if he had known the true intention of the trip, he would have intervened. He was the only trustworthy person in that family. Although I was the victim, the thought of having my honeymoon stolen by my mother-in-law was deeply embarrassing. I considered quitting my job, and my parents suggested taking a vacation. However, my uncle thought work would help distract me and spoke with the CEO. They agreed to transfer me to a branch office, which gave me time to heal and focus. Thanks to an excellent lawyer, the divorce proceedings moved faster than expected. During this process, I learned more about my in-laws' financial situation. They turned out to be an average working family with little savings, worsened by my mother-in-law's spending habits. Understanding the gravity of the situation, my father-in-law had to sell the family home to pay a substantial settlement, considering our short marriage duration. When I returned home with my luggage on what should have been our honeymoon departure day, rumors began spreading in the neighborhood. I watched as rumors about our failed marriage and subsequent scandal spread rapidly through local gossip, becoming increasingly exaggerated until staying in the area became unbearable. My image-conscious mother-in-law, who had initially accepted our marriage for status, could no longer show her face in the community. Presumably overwhelmed by shame and financial pressure, my father-in-law had to shoulder the responsibility for the economic damage caused by his son's actions. Despite my deep contempt for my husband and his mother, I couldn't help but feel profound sympathy for my father-in-law. My husband, now fired and obligated to pay compensation, fell into a deep depression after I decided not to return. These days, he's unable to work, spending his days listlessly in a modest apartment he moved to. Seeing her son in such a state, my mother-in-law became reclusive and isolated. In a candid conversation, my father-in-law revealed he was exhausted by his wife's behavior and considering divorce, asking if I could recommend the lawyer I had used. I immediately contacted my uncle to help arrange communication with the lawyer. Though it might take time, I hope my father-in-law can start a new life and find greater happiness. Thanks to the intervention of the company's CEO and my uncle, I was transferred to a branch office. This transfer has been a blessing, as I'm now surrounded by incredibly supportive colleagues and supervisors. I will be forever grateful to my uncle for helping me during such a difficult time. My only regret is not being able to visit the country we had planned for our honeymoon. Once everything settles, I want to make that overseas trip happen. What was originally meant to be a shared dream, I now want to realize as a journey celebrating new beginnings and personal freedom.